Welcome to the Good Growth Podcast, brought to you by BGF, the most active equity investor in the UK and Ireland. This week, Jimmy is joined by Tim Rea, head of Early Stage at BGF. As an entrepreneur turned investor, Tim has been active in the startup ecosystem for over 20 years. In this episode, he explains how BGF assesses growth potential in early stage businesses, the UK's regulatory environment post-Brexit, and the disruptive technologies that he's excited about.
Tim, what's your role at BGF?
So I am head of early stage investing at BGF, and I think that's by virtue of kicking off early stage investing as we do it now about 5 or 6 years ago.
And BGF isn't necessarily known for kind of early stage investment. What sort of sectors are you specifically looking at?
Interestingly, I think the core, and I always describe it as the core of what BGF does, is that growth stage investing. So, targeting businesses that have, generated some momentum, they've got good commercial traction, and it's easy to assess them really in the sense of, their commercial engagement, what the numbers look like, and how those numbers are trending. And so from that perspective, you can, I think, quite easily tackle a very broad range of businesses, because when you boil it down, you can kind of assess it based on how it's performing and what the next year, 24 months are going to look like. As you move earlier, it becomes more difficult because you don't have the numbers to go by, you don't have customers to talk to sometimes. And so actually it's really important, and I think a key plank of what we've done has been to focus on specific sectors where we can actually develop some depth of understanding about the dynamics of those sectors, how they're playing into a problem space, how technology is impinging both the adoption of new technology, but the generation of new opportunities. So we spent quite a lot of time, I think, deliberating around which sectors to focus on. Really kicked off in 2018 and spent quite a lot of time looking at different sectors, UK economy, what's important. We looked at creative, we looked at life sciences, and of course, because of the kind of growing interest in opportunities around climate and climate-related technologies, we looked at those sectors and really initially focused on life sciences, but life sciences very broadly defined because it's such a big part of the UK economy, and it's an area where actually, as an engine, the UK massively punches above its weight in terms of innovation and technology and breakthroughs. But yet it's a sector that's not as well supported financially as it could be. And that really rang true for us in terms of that wider BGF message of, filling a gap in the market to an extent. Where are there gaps in the market? How can we be additive to the overall ecosystem? And for me, a key driver was, that opportunity to combine impact with making a return on capital.
And the title of this podcast series is called Good Growth. How do you assess good growth potential in an early stage company?
Yeah, I think it goes back probably really to that impact point. And so, it's interesting, just yesterday, for example, we had one of our regular meetings. So every week or every 2 weeks, we'll have a batch of companies that, either we've sourced, somebody's introduced to us, or it's just found its way to us through the website even. And you kind of go through and you assess those companies and you're thinking, which ones of these, because we can't do them all. We have limited capacity. We've got 10 to look at. We might do one of them. Which one of these are we going to do? And one of the dimensions, and we don't have a formulaic way of doing this, but you look at, what do we think of the people, all the usual stuff, what's the potential of this, what validation does this have? So, on balance, something that is a little bit more validated than other things might stand out. But you get to the end of it and you think, actually, this one sort of stands out for a number of reasons. But if you look at the problem that they're solving, could we really get excited about solving that problem versus some of these other problems that need to be solved, which maybe in some cases are just more fundamental?
And what sort of early stage can mean a sort of wide variety? Give us an average of sort of when you're writing the check and what kind of check size you're writing.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at a typical growth deal, and we quite often say you're looking for companies with greater than 5 million of revenue and EBITDA positive. if you think, if BGF is going to do early stage, it's quite rational, logical to think actually early stage will be just before that. And we have looked at that zone. So companies that are maybe generating some revenue, but just aren't quite at the BGF criteria. And do you set up early stage to be a feeder into that? The challenge with that category is that there are a bunch of companies in that bundle that actually don't really grow.
Yeah.
And they don't evolve to be in BGF sweet spot. And there are a bunch of companies in there that have, in some cases, unrealistic expectations in terms of valuation and their likely growth rate and impact when they're benchmarking themselves against a venture style company that might have $1 billion valuation potential. Some of these are never going to top 50, 70. That's not to say they're not interesting, but they're just a different sort of company. And so as an organization, I think we've backed off looking at companies in that zone. And, for us on the early stage side, we're looking at companies that have that really significant potential, companies where we can't legitimately say, actually, this is interesting, but come back and talk to us in 6 months or a year. We do quite a lot of that engagement and say, actually, this will be an ideal growth deal. And so we will do it as a growth deal. And maybe there's something we can do now to help give some advice, make some introductions, but, come back, in a year's time based on your forecast. This early stage group of companies that we're tackling are companies that actually will never track into BGF's normal criteria. So if we don't engage now, we're never going to engage and get there.
And what do you make of the sort of the valley of death that a lot of these deep tech companies go through? This used to be a sort of serious problem. It was something that the UK was seen as, we had a lot of the science side of things, very good at that. But how has the sort of scaling bit improved over the last few years?
I think it's still a problem. And I think it's a problem because it's a multi-dimensional issue. And I think simplistically, it's tempting to home in on a single dimension of the issue and say, the challenge is that companies can't access, big checks. There's not an investor who will write a £100 million investment into this, struggling company that needs to jump over that hurdle. And while that is sometimes true, my view would be that if you take a step back, I think you'd be safe in saying that companies that deserve large checks will get large checks. And whether it comes from a UK investor or a US investor, it just doesn't matter. If they deserve it, they will get it. And the challenge has always been to deserve it. And if you unpack that, I think a big challenge in the UK has been talent. And it's both the availability of the talent, but it's also the willingness of some of those earlier stage companies with really interesting, innovative ideas to actually evolve and adopt and bring in that new talent. And we've got lots of interesting examples in our portfolio of where that's worked and companies have embraced that, and cases where it hasn't. And it's always painful. Evolution is painful, but the fact of the matter is some people are very good at certain stages of the process. Once in a while, people are good at taking something all the way through. But more often than not, you're going to really need to augment teams and grow teams and evolve teams throughout the journey. And I think the challenges with navigating the valley of death is really a challenge of bringing on the right talent and integrating that talent into the team in the right way.
And on the talent, what is important when it comes to scaling talent? What do we need?
Yeah, I think maybe the simplest answer to that is people who have already done it, rather than people who are figuring it out. And sometimes you can find a happy medium in there with people who are figuring it out because people have to learn at some stage, but guided by people who have done it before. And that's where one of our areas of focus has always been trying to understand how to augment a team with non-executive talent. So we spend a lot of time trying to find the right chair for a business, for example. And again, it's not always easy to get right, but if you get it right, I think you can have a pretty big impact. There's really, though, no substitute for some of the critical functions of a business. And if you look at life sciences, for example, some of the critical functions around regulatory process, U.S. market entry, if you haven't done those things before, you can figure out a lot of stuff. You can go talk to people and, kind of put together a plan. But unless you've done it before, unless you know people and already have a bit of a network to kind of pull in the people who can help you do a thing, you're going to be prone to error. If you're an early stage company or a company that's dependent on financing, you'll have a runway that you planned. You've got your roadmap. You might have a little bit of flexibility in there, but you've got to get it right first time.
Yeah.
If you don't get it right first time, you're going back around the loop and saying, a regulatory delay can be 6 months, 9 months, sometimes a year. You've got to keep the organization going for a year. We've got a company that did a very good job in those circumstances where they actually had a very complicated product that they were developing. They delivered this complicated product within a month of their target date. So, pretty amazing on the scale of things. And then the regulator, because of, regulatory chaos in the UK, the regulator just couldn't engage when they originally planned to. So 12-month delay, that company needs funding for another 12 months. And that's always quite challenging. If you've got somebody who has been through that loop before, they might have an existing relationship with a regulator. They might have good relationships with regulatory consultants.
Yeah.
They might have planned things a little bit more thoroughly, and you might have avoided that sort of scenario.
Has the UK had particularly regulatory chaos over the last few years as a result of Brexit and having several prime ministers? Is that a sort of real life impact that
Definitely
happens on business?
Beyond any shadow of a doubt. Yeah, the UK, from an EU perspective, was the hub of EU regulatory activities. I think there were some good people there. I think it ran, as smoothly as these things ever run. But I think a common complaint that we've definitely heard consistently from almost every company is that things have been completely chaotic, to the extent that at times they complain about not even being able to get a response.
Yeah, that's not great. Give us an example of some of the companies that are in the portfolio at the moment and what they're doing across the kind of different sectors we've talked about: life sciences, climate and sustainability. Give us an example of what they're doing and the problems they're solving.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, starting in life sciences, we tend to define that quite broadly. For some people, when you say life sciences, it just automatically means new drug development, discovery. That we call that biotech. But we sort of partition that market and say, there's the biotech piece. That doesn't work so well for us because of the nature of our fund. And in the UK, we've got some really great investors that just do that type of investing. But if you take a step back, there are a class of company that is playing into new drug development, but more from a platform perspective. So instead of having one asset that they're taking through the clinical process, you might have a platform company that has some technology that supports the development of multiple assets or identifies multiple targets. And those have not been as well supported maybe as they should be. So we focused on those. We have a nice little cluster of those companies where, again, they can generate multiple drugs over a period of time. So we have a company called Foremost, for example, that is doing very well. A company in Aberdeen called Elasmogen, again, doing some very interesting stuff with different types of drugs. And the plans for those companies will always revolve around developing things to a certain extent and then partnering with other companies, pharma companies, to then take those things through clinical. We also have a diagnostics cluster, and diagnostics, I think, has been a difficult category, just probably globally, but particularly in the UK from an investor support perspective. And it's quite frustrating because you can actually see areas where there's a really clear market need. You can then meet companies where there's very interesting technology that could potentially meet that market need.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you break it down and analyze it, you think, okay, problem, solution, but economically it just doesn't stack up.
Yeah.
Because even if you tested everybody in the world, you're only charging £50, so it's never going to make enough money. So I think there's a challenge with a lot of diagnostic companies in the maybe lower end of the spectrum. However, there are some advanced diagnostic companies that we're spending time with, and some of those are more in the early detection, early identification of problems. And if you look at cancer, the earlier you spot cancer, the more treatment options you'll have with that cancer. The problem when you get into early diagnostics is you get challenges with not finding too many people. There's a point beyond which identifying that somebody has cancer is really useful.
Yeah.
There's a point ahead of which it might not be that useful because you might end up streaming people down towards treatments that they didn't actually need. So some of those tricky areas around diagnostics are super interesting problems to try to figure out and navigate. But I think that's where maybe a lot of our massive gains will come from in the next 10 to 20 years. And then we have a med tech cluster. And again,
And just why do you think the advances of that 10 to 20 years, why do you think the advances will come then? And give us an example of what it might look like.
So I think early identification of problems, first of all, it has got to deliver, the biggest potential gains. And so, finding that somebody has early signs of neurodegeneration, for example, will open up treatment options. And if you think about Alzheimer's and neurodegeneration, a lot of news in the last couple of years about the first couple of treatments that are finally approved. If you look at those treatments, they're slightly tricky because they extend some hope, but they're really about slowing the progression of a disease by maybe 25%.
Yeah.
If you're slowing the progression of disease, you want to start that slowing process as soon as you can in the course of the disease because you're preserving more function. And so how do you actually identify the people who can get that disease, who can actually take that drug to treat that disease? But if you actually look at the side effect profiles of those drugs, they're non-trivial.
Yeah.
So you need to make sure that the people who are getting the drug are really the people who need the drug. And you need to monitor them to make sure that actually the drug is being efficacious and having an impact.
Yeah.
Because you don't want people on the drug if it's not having an impact. And so it's all of those things around early identification. It's around identifying who can benefit from the drug and making sure they are continuing to benefit from the drug. If you look at cancer, there are increasingly a large quantity of drugs that a clinician might have to choose from when it comes to treating a patient. In the not too distant past, it was one or two things you might choose, and you might throw everything at it to see what happens. Now you might have half a dozen drugs that you can choose from, and the question becomes quite quickly, well, which drug should I give this patient? And you can increasingly identify which drug a patient will respond to, and you can identify and monitor that response. But interestingly, over the course of the treatment, the cancer in a patient's body could well develop a resistance to that drug.
Yeah.
Cancer is a very creative disease. And so you actually need to evolve the treatments, identify when that resistance is building up, and maybe move on to the next drug. So all of those things require advanced diagnostic capabilities.
Yeah. What are the early signs of Alzheimer's?
So that's a very interesting, deep question with probably a very long answer.
The whole other podcast.
The really interesting thing is if you think about it, just from a human perception perspective, and it's probably the same with most diseases. If you think about, you wake up one day and you feel ill, you always think back and think, actually, I didn't feel that well 3 days ago, but I didn't notice it 3 days ago. I notice it now because I'm now ill. And I think neurodegeneration, dementia, Alzheimer's is probably an extreme form of that. By the time, probably not you, but those around you have noticed an issue, it's been there for a long time, and you'll very quickly track back and think, actually, 5 years ago, now I remember this person was quite forgetful or was struggling to think of somebody's name, and I didn't think anything of it at the time. But now that they, can't find their way to their car, it all makes sense. The challenging thing about relying on that is by the time you get to that stage, physiologically, biologically, so many things have happened. You're so far gone that it's almost hard to treat. And if you think about it from a drug development perspective, it's really hard to run a clinical trial for your drug if you can't find people who are early in the course of the disease So a lot of the challenge around dementia has been trying to understand how you identify early signs of it.
Yeah.
So you can actually pick patients to run studies on. The biggest problem with dementia, Alzheimer's, and that whole area is that there are almost certainly multiple forms of the disease.
Yeah.
We quite simplistically try to say, we've got one thing. What's the cause of that thing?
Yeah.
We've got multiple things, and we probably actually really don't know the causes of any of those things.
Yeah.
We have some things that maybe at best correlate. This is my view. So if you look at the current drugs, they're focused on treating a very specific thing, amyloid plaques that build up in the brain.
Okay.
If you actually take tests for an individual, 5 years before it's clear that they have dementia, and look for traces of amyloid in the cerebral spinal fluid,
Yeah.
or doing a PET scan of the brain, it tends to be poorly predictive of the development of the disease. And if from a pathological perspective, posthumously, if you analyze the brains of individuals who are thought to have dementia and some who are thought not to have dementia, you can find the pathology in people who were thought not to have dementia that matches the pathology of people who were thought to have dementia.
Yeah.
It's a really, really tricky thing to figure out. We've recently backed a company in Oxford called Oxford Brain Diagnostics, and we were drawn to what they're doing because, first of all, it came out of 20 years of analysis of brain tissue samples and trying to understand the key characteristics of brain tissue and what signals imply neurodegeneration.
Yeah.
And they developed a technique using quite straightforward standard MRI analysis, MRI techniques. And they can now quantify neurodegeneration by looking at the quality of brain tissue. And that is, I think, emerging as something that is independent of disease hypothesis. So it doesn't matter if you believe it's all down to amyloid or if you believe it's all down to inflammation. Kind of doesn't matter what it is if you look at the actual physiological nature of the tissue and you can quantify neurodegeneration. And even better if you can quantify that in the context of what's called cognitive reserve. So some people, like it or not, just have more to work with, and so can tolerate a degree of neurodegeneration, whereas some others can't. If you can assess that objectively, you have a lot more to work with. That sort of approach gets us excited because it's more fundamental than throwing everything behind a specific hypothesis in a disease area.
That is really interesting. I hadn't planned to go quite so much into sort of brain neurology, but you are very good at explaining these things, so it's very interesting. Give us some examples of some of the other companies you're excited about in the portfolio that are doing interesting things.
We have, on a similar kind of thread, we have a company also in Oxford called Caristo Diagnostics. They're working in cardiovascular disease. Very interesting founding team of cardiologists from Oxford. And they have studied the problem of diagnosing heart attack risk. So I'm sure lots of other people have maybe had a similar experience to me where you go and you talk to your doctor and they eyeball you on the way in and they think, okay, you're this age, you've got these characteristics. They might ask you a couple of questions about your family. And because my father and my grandfather didn't eat well and didn't exercise and probably lived very stressful lives, they had heart attacks before they were 60, which automatically makes me doomed. Even though I think, well, I don't know. I feel pretty good right now. But that statistically driven approach to telling someone, this we think, kind of might drive what happens to you in the next, kind of 5 years. I think a lot of people find difficult to accept because if they say, look, 5 out of 10 people who are in your category are going to have a heart attack. I think, well, I might be one of those lucky 5. I think if you can actually, though, look again physiologically at an individual and say, forget about all the statistics. We've looked at you, we've looked inside you, and we looked at your arteries, and this is really where you are at and what you need to do about it.
Yeah.
So much more impactful. So this particular company is leveraging the fact that for Europe and the US, there's been a move towards first line of investigation being a heart CT scan when somebody shows up at the hospital with chest pain. They look at the scan and, first of all, there's a process of somebody having a heart attack or not. It's surprisingly difficult to figure out if somebody's having a heart attack or not. It can take quite a while. If they're not having a heart attack, the next question is, what is the underlying driver of this chest pain? They look at the CT scan and they'll say, really there's either a major blockage or not a major blockage. So there's a big fixation with, is there a major blockage or not? When in fact, if you analyze the data, the larger proportion of heart attacks aren't linked to a large blockage. They're just linked to some plaque deposit that ruptures. And that rupturing event is driven by inflammation in the artery wall. And so this company, Christo in Oxford, benefited, as do some of these, I think, companies that do well, benefited from having access to large quantities of data. And so they were able to leverage their access to patients to analyze at a molecular level what was going on in the arteries of people who had these sorts of problems. They were then able to develop imaging analysis techniques to correlate machine learning based analysis of images with what they had identified from the actual analysis, molecular analysis of tissue, so that they can now spot the areas of inflammation in an artery that are likely to trigger a rupture of plaque, and it doesn't matter how big it is. And so in their studies, they're taking patients who have been basically released to say, you should be fine, you don't have a major blockage. 45% of those people who are sent home as being kind of roughly okay are redesignated as a result of this analysis as needing some to be on a different care pathway.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting.
So that's very, very interesting, impactful. We've got a couple of projects that are more in the early cancer identification space, and I think kind of operating in stealth mode. But there are some very interesting things coming down the pipe on that. Though I think, again, when you get innovation at the early part of the process, it has knock-on effects in terms of what you then do with that information and how you stage treatments and what kind of treatments you kind of put in place. But it's kind of interesting to think some of those things through and to be involved in the companies, because every investment we make, we're also on the board. We live with the company. Sometimes we live with the company longer than we expect to, and you're involved in all of these processes of finding your way through and understanding what impact does this have on the care pathway. Who do we need to work with to start to define some of those changes and look ahead 3 or 4 or 5 years? Probably takes us back to that point of having the right people around the table.
Yeah, really interesting how you augment those talent teams. One of the things that obviously gets brought up a lot is AI. And you sent me a paper in advance of this, which from 2015, which I found fascinating, kind of predicting the future of AI. But can you talk us through the thesis of that paper about how quick trends are speeding up?
Yeah. And so first of all, a qualifier, I'm not an AI expert. I just meet a lot of companies who are doing some things in AI. So I pick bits and pieces up. So apologies to any experts who may listen and criticize. That's my qualifier. That specific paper was actually a blog post, and it was by a guy called Tim Rea, who I think has always done a good job of picking up quite complicated things and breaking them down and explaining them and inserting enough profanity and funny cartoons to make it entertaining. But I thought that particular series was very good, and I pulled it out and shared it with my kids to get them to think about things. But I think the interesting the interesting starting point, and I haven't read it for a while, but the interesting starting point for me is just articulating the accelerating pace of technological development, and just that concept that actually it's not a constant thing.
Yeah.
The progress that we make now is so much faster than the progress that we would have made in 2015 or in 2000 or in 1990, because we have more tools to apply
Yeah.
to developing things. And so there's a constant acceleration, which naturally drives more of an exponential type curve. As humans, we always think everything's linear.
Yes.
And it's really hard for us to take a step back and think, okay, between here and here, we made this much progress. So, it's going to, look quite similar if we project out. And it's also not perfectly exponential, because actually, you naturally get, waves of technology. And if we look back just in, the last 20, 30 years, the emergence of the internet, and, it changes a lot of things, but then it feels like actually things are kind of steadying up now, and maybe that's it for innovation, and there are going to be no more breakthroughs, and then bam, something else happens. It always works that way. So you get a sort of S-curve effect, but you could superimpose those S-curves over a sort of exponential growth curve over time. But the thing that's, I think, really interesting is just starting with this concept of, I forget the exact term that the author uses for it, but this concept that if you go back in time to 1750 and you bring somebody from 1750 to today, of course they're going to be astounded that things are so different today, but they're probably astounded to the extent that they die. It's just so shocking that they can't, take it on, and their heads explode. If you go back to 1750 and say, well, how far back from there do you have to go to find somebody whose head would explode in 1750? You might have to go back to like 10,000 BC. It's a really long way back.
Yeah.
And if you go back to 10,000 BC, how far back beyond that do you have to go before you can find somebody who would be impressed by the fact that you have fire?
Yeah.
You probably do. It's a really big gap. So key thing, those gaps are shrinking. The question then is, how far into the future would we have to go before we would reach a point where our heads would explode because we wouldn't be able to comprehend the nature of how things are?
Yeah.
And it might be like 20 years.
Yeah. It's frightening to sort of think about it. And I think that's one of the things of, we think change, people will never adopt things, but then very suddenly there is sort of mass adoption of these things. And that just continues to get sort of quicker and quicker in the modern world, right?
Yes. And, you can, there are lots of different categories maybe of innovation. And I think there are the odd things where, the thing pops up and people think, oh my gosh, that changes everything, and tomorrow I will only do things that way. I don't think there are many things in that category. If you take something fairly mundane like Uber, I think, well, Uber's fairly, kind of ubiquitous now. I honestly can't tell you how many business pitches I had from companies wanting to revolutionize transport or taxis.
Yeah.
And you look at every single one of them and you think, yeah, right, good, thanks, well done. I agree with you on the problem. Not so sure about the solution. Too many obstacles to overcome. But yet, when somebody draws the boundary around a thing in the right way, it works, and it often works pretty quickly. But even it's quick in retrospect. When you're in the middle of it, it's not particularly quick. It's an evolutionary change. And I was in the middle of a lot of things to do with mobile technology when the iPhone came out. And if you'd set lots of people down at a table and said, in a perfect world, if you actually were to build the perfect device to just make all of this work, what would it look like? They would have sketched out something, similar to the iPhone. Well, you need the right sort of data network. You need the content people and the mobile operators to collaborate, play ball. Basically, you need to herd a bunch of cats and force everybody to do the right thing. It's pretty clear what needed to be done, but to get somebody to actually do that, is a revolutionary step in the context of an evolution.
And what do you think the kind of like modern day rails are? Like, you talk about all those things that needed to come together to make the mobile work. and for it to become such a important factor in all of our lives. What do you think are the modern day rails that we're now going to need for AI to work? I mean, quantum computing, it must be one of the big ones, right?
Well, maybe we can come back to quantum computing because I think it's a different sphere altogether almost. But if you look in more kind of mundane terms, there's already a kind of, and actually, let's look at life sciences specifically in healthcare. There is already so much more that we can do technically than we are able to actually do practically, because it requires the healthcare system, it requires the clinical people, it requires the people who pay for stuff to all get behind and agree to do it. And how do you actually define around a specific technology, an ability to redefine the whole care pathway for a specific disease just because you've developed something that delivers you an early insight? How do you actually, get the backing that you need to force something into the system and to actually accelerate the adoption rather than to just rely on that gradual process of evolution? If you look, and I can call out 2 or 3 of our portfolio companies, there's a standard view in the UK that actually it's so painful to work with the NHS that one shouldn't really bother.
Yeah.
Too much trouble, too little money to be made, and it's just painful. Even if you try to give stuff away, it's painful. And in that context, we've got 2 companies that are doing very well, and a third, I think, that we're working on that might actually play into the same dynamic, where they've identified abstractly the problem of massive waiting lists. So a big waiting list is something that politicians care about. A big waiting list is something obviously patients care about, but also clinicians. And so if you take something like endoscopy, looking at somebody's esophagus because they've had heartburn for years, might be a multi-year waiting list to see a clinician who will stick something down your gullet and have a look. It's frustrating for the clinician because you know that probably only about 10% of the people you examine are going to have something that actually needed to be worried about. So you've got this massive waiting list, big exercise, not very nice for the patient, but your yield is about 10%.
Yeah.
We've got a company called Cited in our portfolio that we invested in last year, and they have a very simple solution with a complicated test. So the practical bit of collecting a sample is a pill on a string. So you literally swallow the pill, goes into the stomach, it dissolves, and a sponge pops out. And then a nurse, and ideally one that's done it a few times, hoiks it back up pretty quickly, and you almost don't even notice. And it collects cell samples all along the wall of the esophagus. They then do a fairly sophisticated test on that sample and will very quickly say whether a patient has something to worry about or not. And so suddenly, from a clinical perspective, all you need to do is look at the 10% that they identify as probably having an issue. That's really impactful.
Yeah, it is. Gosh, yeah, you can really see how that changes. Where do you think, if you were starting your career now, what excites you most? Where would you be looking?
If I think back, in my own case, what sort of drove my choices, and I only reflected on this recently. I was probably transitioning from a view that I just wanted to do music and be a musician, to thinking actually maybe there are other things I can do. And so there was this moment where you think, actually, if I could do anything, what would it be? And I remember reading an article, and I'm pretty sure it was in Newsweek, and it was in the 1980s, and it was talking about the miraculous or potentially miraculous breakthroughs in superconductivity. incredibly interesting if you think about the disruptive impact of superconductivity, especially room temperature superconductivity. It's everything from distribution of power through the grid. Suddenly you're not losing so much power in distribution, and so maybe you go from having a scarcity to having a glut of power because of the way you're consuming it. If I then project forward, actually that drove me into the kind of physics and chemistry and material science, which defined the first part of my career, which took me into working with amorphous materials and working in optoelectronics. And then one thing leads to another, and somehow I'm here working in life sciences and investing. But I think, for anyone, I think having that opportunity to pause and just to reflect and to pause in the context of thinking, actually, I could do anything, is maybe what we don't often get and what people aren't so often encouraged to do. And I think particularly I'm struck by how the UK system streams people really quite early, even if inadvertently. And I think actually for people, it doesn't matter if you've just failed all of your GCSEs and you're not going to do A-levels and you're doing something else, or you've just failed all of your A-levels and you're thinking, okay, I don't get any of my university places. It doesn't matter, even if you've done that and you've worked for 2 or 3 years. I think for people who are very early on in their careers even, to take that opportunity to just pause and think, if I wanted to, I could have a completely blank sheet of paper. And if I had a completely blank sheet of paper, what would I do? Even if it means I'm going back to some of the fundamentals and actually building a new foundation. I was going to live for so long. We're living for ages. Like, there's no hurry. Go back and do your GCSEs again if you want to. Do something completely different, but do it based on having reflected and identified from a passion perspective. Actually, that's incredibly interesting, maybe incredibly impactful. I'd love to be a part of solving that problem.
I think that is a brilliant way to finish the episode, Tim. We may have to get you on again to talk about quantum computing.
Yeah, save that for another day.
But honestly, it's so good talking to you about all different things, and you give a really uplifting view in a world that can sometimes feel a bit sort of daunting, etc. It really is fascinating talking to you about the future of energy and healthcare, etc. So thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. It's all to play for.